My name is James Button. I work at the Grattan Institute, but I wrote speeches for Kevin Rudd for a year or so, and before that I was a journalist with the Age newspaper for a long time. We're very lucky tonight to have Don Watson here. Don's one of those people who famously needs no introduction, but I'll just say a few things about him quickly. He was born in Gippsland, of Scottish farming stock, I think Poowong, Don, or Loch, was it?
Halfway between.
Halfway between.
Yeah.
And he began his working life as an academic historian, and he wrote 3 books, including a book about the Scots in Gippsland called Caledonia Australis. He then turned his hand to writing satire, first of one kind, which was writing for the Gillies Report, and then of another kind, which was writing for politicians. He wrote for John Cain first, and through that process he became speechwriter to Paul Keating, as you know. In 2001 he published Recollections of a Bleeding Heart, and that book, I can't name how many prizes it won, and probably you can't either, Don, but...
Wasn't enough.
It's never enough. I was thumbing through all the pages of glowing reports at the front of the book just before, and just to name one, Michael Gordon of The Age described it as a masterpiece. If you want to read what really happens inside Canberra, read this book. So many people liked the book, but one person didn't, and that person, of course, was the subject of the book. And Don, I thought I'd start by asking you, obviously it's 10 years, the nominal reason why we're here is that it's 10 years since the publication of your book, but why did you decide to have it republished at this time with a fresh afterword? Can you tell us about that?
Well, the idea of republishing it was really to keep the book alive, as everyone wants to with their books. It's, it was still in print, but we thought it was a good idea to get it up and running again. And so that's just a matter of fact reason. The reason for writing the afterward, I guess I was always going to have to do that. I'd spoken to Carmen Lawrence, and she was very happy to write a forward. And as Carmen sort of knew us both, that seemed like an interesting prospect. But I have to say, the afterward was shaped somewhat by the fact that after really a 9-year silence, Paul, the last conversation I had with Paul was a year after the book was launched, when I happened to be in Sydney, and I thought I'd see if there was any common ground that we might meet on for a drink, and it wasn't a happy phone call. And 9 years later, late last year, he wrote a piece in the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age, which I found, well, the newspapers tend to call it, a startling claim. Well, this was a startling claim that I was claiming to have written speeches that really he was probably the author of. That I was claiming too much in all this. I mean, I found it simply astonishing, and it was about the Redfern speech, and I didn't want to respond in the op-ed pages because for reasons of seemliness, it didn't seem like a proper thing to do, to be arguing about the authorship of the Redfern speech, of all things. I mean, I don't know what I would say next time I bumped into Mick Dodson or Noel Pearson or someone. Oh, really, actually, it was all about who wrote it, not about anything else. And there was an election on, and that didn't seem right. So I didn't say anything, but decided I'd address the matter in the afterward. There's also a problem with these things that you get sort of stuck in there, and you can't win these sorts of arguments. But I did want to just put it down for the record that I had never claimed anything that properly belonged to Paul. My position on speech writing. I mean, the other thing was that he said that Graham Freudenberg had said I'd broken the contract. Well, I rang Freudenberg the moment I'd read it, and not true. Freudenberg had never said such a thing. He's on record as saying that he never said such a thing. So Paul was a bit naughty pulling that stunt.
Just about in there for a second, can you explain to us what the contract is?
Well, the contract is understood by everybody, from all kinds of speechwriters. That one writes the speech. Speechwriters might write a speech, but the speech belongs to the person who delivers it, because they put it to their purposes. They make the judgment about whether... I say a speech is really advice, like any other advice in a political office, formally composed. It's not in dot points, it's in sentences. By and large, that's all it is. And as a Prime Minister will at any time, he will decide what he's going to use and what he's not. And that's it. And happiness for a speechwriter, as it is for any other kind of advisor, is the Prime Minister accepting the advice. That's just, and if he accepts every word of it, that's just pure bliss. It's not saying, "Oh, it's your speech, mate." Not at all. That's never the case. So I don't know. Paul can do unusual things, but I thought this was very unusual. And you don't believe me. I've said this on public platforms 1,000 times when people have referred to the speech as, one speech or another as mine. I've always said, actually, the speech is Paul's. It always is. I've said it on platforms with Graham Freudenberg. We furiously agree. I came across Ted Sorensen, JFK's speechwriter, saying exactly the same thing in almost exactly the same words. They take all the consequences. If it's a dud, they cop it. And it's not always over straight away. Sorensen's famous speech, or Kennedy's famous speech, the inaugural address, "Ask not what your country can do for you," and all that, contains a passage which you'll all remember. If you're over about 60, you will anyway. And it's Kennedy's speech about that we will do a number of these things. It's classic American rhetoric to defend liberty. Now, Kennedy has got enormous credit for this speech over the last 50 years. But now historians like James Patterson, for instance, writing truly magisterial accounts of American politics and history, say, actually, that was a rallying cry. It was full of inflated and disingenuous hopes. It was a rallying cry for a war that cost 2 million lives in Vietnam, and it warped American politics for decades. So Kennedy's reputation is now taking a terrible battering over words that he chose to utter 60 years ago.
It's interesting, isn't it? History is continually reworking.
Yes, and it seems to me political leaders, and this is what speechwriters don't have to worry about this, advisors don't. They're only ever, footnotes, if that. They're very safe. But political leaders, and I think this is why they get so worried about the record, in a number of ways. They can be abused in the op-ed pages every day, in editorials. They can be cartooned in the most vicious ways. They can live with that. Paul could sort of live with it. He usually rang people up and abused them for half an hour and then gave them some advice on music they should be listening to or something. But a book about them is an existential question. It really goes to the heart of who they will be and how they'll be judged. The fact is that they can't determine this. They can't tell people how to write their history. If they write autobiographies, as Paul always said, they're all self-serving, these autobiographies by Hawke or any of the rest of them. So they hope that someone will write, it seems to me, a magisterial account in their own lifetime that they can have a certain say in. And in that I'm disappointed to the extent that he felt that I'd betrayed him.
Well, that's that distinction you make between a distant account, like a magisterial account, as if the person is invisible on the ceiling, and a personal account in which you are present. And I just wonder whether, if you had written the magisterial account, or if you'd written a mediocre book, whether Paul would have actually not minded at all.
I think he would have liked a really stunning book.
But magisterial.
But magisterial. Yes.
He would have been disappointed by the mediocre book, but not...
Not as disappointed as he was in this case, no. No, I think that's right. In fact, I know that's right.
So it's something about the personal quality of the book which goes to, I guess, your relationship with him. I'm struck that Noel Pearson said that your book was a love story. And then you write in the afterward, and I've often pondered that might have been the problem. Can you explain what you meant?
Yeah, well, Noel said, I got Noel to launch it. It took me about 5 days to track him down, as it always does, but he was very keen to do it, and he said, and I said to him, don't, if you're going to come down from Hopevale, don't think you've got to, to talk about the book and anything, just make a speech, let them know you're here, which he did for a very long period until most of them were barely conscious.
As he himself, to his credit, has acknowledged.
Yes, which is why many of them missed the point of Paul, beating me to death when he spoke later.
Because they were drunk or asleep.
About to. But
I've known people who were there who had no idea that Paul had savaged you.
No.
It was fine.
Yeah, that's right.
And yet you obviously noticed.
Oh, I noticed. A few others did. But he said, I said, well, he said, he read it and he said, he liked it. And I said, well, that's good, I wish Paul did. And he said, well, how come he doesn't like it? And I said, I don't know, he hates it, really hates it. And he said, it's mad, it's a love story. And I thought that was, well, it's true, I did love the bloke. You couldn't work for Paul unless you loved him. You'd go balmy if you didn't. He could be totally bewildering sometimes. But you always were at a sense of... Paul was always in a conversation about the future. When everyone else was talking about what the latest polls were, or they were off doing doorstops at 6:30 in the morning, and they were out jogging like John Hewson, or swimming like Tony Abbott does, or taking their shirt off like Tony Abbott does, all this sort of stuff. They're always talking about the recent past and what Anzac means and all that sort of stuff. Paul was actually still up at the lodge, having a conversation about what might be. That's really what he was always thinking that way. He was truly a man of a very specific vision. And by the time I got to know him, he had a narrative built around that was tremendously strong, which made it very easy to work for him. You weren't trying to invent a vision. And what's astonishing is the way that the moment he lost the election, Labor dropped the whole thing and thought they'd start their own narrative, which after 10 years appeared to be Howard wins and they lose. That was their narrative.
But it was a reaction against Paul, wasn't it, as well? They fled from Paul after
Absolutely.
that. Yeah.
It was astounding. And by fleeing from Paul, they fled from their own recent history and any grasp of the future.
Absolutely. I think that's true. And there's a great quote that Paul once said, that the Labor Party is like a bike. You've got to keep pedalling or you fall off. They stop pedalling.
I'm not saying a word about that.
Yes, that's in your book.
Don't tell him I said that.
Yes, yes.
We said it 100 times, I reckon.
Did he?
The bicycle metaphor.
Did he? Yes. That's a good one. Yes.
Yeah, it is good.
Just on that, I want to... this is from the book. You say that about Keating, the government had no better warrior, no more persuasive advocate, no mind as powerfully creative, and no one with a prouder recent record of achievement. Keating was sometimes willful and self-absorbed, occasionally full of mad rage, damn near uncivilised. It had something to do with the blessings of childhood having left him without much fear of judgment. He was never worried about enemies. Well, I guess what I want to ask you is, do you think that the things that made Paul Keating great and made him do the things that he was able to do, especially as treasurer, do you think they were also the things that made him enraged about your book?
Possibly, yeah.
He was of a whole, if you like.
Yeah. Sometimes, I don't know. He had a childhood that was not like mine, that's for sure. And I think sometimes, they like that in the Labor Party, though. They don't like to be crossed. They take it very badly. I remember saying to Bill Kelty once, it's funny, all Paul's enemies seemed to be former friends, and Bill didn't say anything for about 30 seconds, and then he said, same with me. I mean, I regret it. I can't maintain hatreds quite that long, but that's not to say that Paul doesn't feel that he has a very good case against me. I mean, I actually respect his case against me. I just think it's wrong.
So what is that case at its best?
Well, we were good friends, and he trusted me implicitly, and I think because I didn't show him the manuscript, I'd intended to, and then I was advised by a very senior Australian journalist that I would be completely mad at the last minute when I said that I've only got one thing to do, and that's show it to Paul. And he said, for God's sake, don't do it. You'll never get it published. Not in the way you want it. And so I said to Paul, well, I don't... look, I'm not going to show it to you. You'll have to trust me. So he did. And then when he read it, he was outraged. So he felt that this was a scam, that I'd actually set him up.
But what was it, Don? If you look at your text, what was it?
I can't see it. I know I say some hard things, but it seems to me, I wish someone had if someone wrote 700 pages about me, I'd be very happy with that. Of that kind, I mean, I think it's very hard to read any judgment of oneself, especially from someone close. That's one of the virtues of being dead at your own funeral, because you don't hear what they say about you. Well, this is what they make of your life, and you were my best friend. I wouldn't read a book about myself unless someone went over it first and said, read this bit and this bit and this bit. But you can't afford to dodge these things if you're a politician. It's a habit to read the worst as well as the best. But I think the book is affectionate on virtually every page. And I think there's a misreading there, because I think he thinks that the criticisms that I make in the course of the book, which are really meant as objective criticism, I tried to write it so that my voice was really like a kind of internal talkback. I drew it all from a diary I kept at the time, and he knew I was keeping. And that was really all my anxieties about what he was doing expressed. They weren't... This is the advantage of writing, for him, of the book I wrote, that it's not a magisterial view. It's not saying this is history's judgment at any point. It's always saying this is my judgment, and it's my judgment on the day, not even a considered judgment. It's just... So that sort of close-up... I mean, what I felt was that giving up the authority of a godlike or fly-like view, I wasn't giving up any authority that I had. I didn't have that. I was too close. So I may as well make a virtue of the problem, the normal problem, which was my proximity. So I'd write from in here and try and give a day-by-day, blow-by-blow sort of account of what life was like there. And because you'll know, what... Well, put it this way, if we think of a turner and a constable, I was trying to write that, inside the storm and what's going on this side of the doors and what's presented on the other side, which is really the extraordinary thing about any political office, that you're...
But you don't neglect the policy. That's what I think is important about the book, is you've written a book that combines the politics and the policy, the things the government's trying to do, with the personal side. We never get those books. They're just not written. So you get a bit of it. You might get the policy, or you might get a gossipy journalistic treatment of, who was shafting whom, but you don't get them all put together. And I think that's not about retailing gossip. It's about describing what it's like for a human being to be in that job that almost nobody does.
That's what I was trying to do. I mean, really, I was trying to write it. I mean, I had this diary which I'd kept most days I was there, most weeks. And had I written a magisterial sort of book, it would have been a sort of aide memoir. In this case, it became the voice. And I don't think... I'm not sure that Paul actually had read a book like this before. I think this book published in the United States would have been unexceptional. it wouldn't have been so alarming. My American friends who read it didn't understand why Paul was so hostile to it. In fact, no one else referred to in the book is hostile to it, although I've been quite critical of other people in the book at the time, or
That's
made judgments
You've
about
been more
them.
critical of other people than of him, saying they weren't hostile.
Well, none of the major players have stopped talking to me. Although many of them I haven't spoken to, so maybe they're very angry, I don't know. I guess what I find difficult to understand is that I can understand the irritation, but I can't understand the total lifetime hostility. But that's all right. Paul's bringing out a collection of his own speeches and articles in November, and as someone said on television the other night, I can expect to be lashed furiously.
Really?
Well, a good lashing is an old Sydney tradition. But, yeah.
It's do you miss him?
Yeah, I do. Well, yes, we used to talk a lot. And it was like a kind of, there was a very, it was a very strong relationship. I mean, and there was a sense of a shared project. I mean, which he led, and I'm totally. I mean, I've always felt that I was sort of Sancho Panza to Paul, or Ishmael to his Ahab, but I mean, he was also Ishmael as well as Ahab, and especially when he was talking to the Sydney Morning Herald, and he was Sancho as much as he was Don Quixote. I mean, Keating, for all his terrific, and I say this, I think many times in the book, there would be times when you'd think, and he was always being painted as this man who was likely to do anything wild. For the most part, Keating was making very astute, calm judgments about many things. And trying to keep the big picture in mind while he was dealing with those things which might otherwise cause great damage. And making the best of what was not a really opportune time to become Prime Minister, on the back of a recession for which he was held to be responsible.
Tough.
And at the end of a long period of Labor office, having got it in the way that he didn't want to get it, which was knocking Hawke off. Yeah, so he's a man of very great political abilities. He always reminded me a bit of LBJ in the way he dealt in politics. He had that same extraordinary ability to charm. Whether it lasted so long, I don't know. I remember him speaking at Corowa to a largely National Party organisation about audience about the Republic, and charming them totally. And then I would imagine the next morning over breakfast where they wouldn't be looking at each other, I thought, as if they'd done something shameful the night before. And they'd go out and beat their dogs that morning or something.
He had many qualities. I mean, his courage, of course, and the courage to push through things that, in the teeth of that recession, they just kept going with their reform. But I think the thing that strikes me most in particular in light of your book is his phenomenal capacities as a storyteller. Can you talk about that? Because you're a storyteller, so that must have attracted you to him in the first place, and I think you still believe it.
Well, I think that's what made it both easy and very often, exhilarating. That they'd already established a very strong narrative. I mean, the depression the recession sort of stumped them. How do you sell the economic reforms when you've got 10% unemployment and police signs up and down the main streets of the major cities? That was a difficult tale to tell, and they were only really saved by John Hewson. We started telling his narrative instead of with a few diversions into national issues. But Hewson was heaven sent for Paul.
Probably no one else would have...
No one else could have lost that election, apart from a young zealot from Johns Hopkins, with believing that he had all the answers, who made, a neocon really, who made Paul's deregulatory economics look like socialism. And but of course politicians never accept good luck. There's no such thing as good luck in politics unless it's the other person. So really, and I think they all need luck, and Paul didn't get a lot, but he got John Hewson. That's how he got the extra 3 years. And then he got Alexander Downer, and the bad luck was that he didn't get him just at the right time. And if only they'd kept Hewson for another 6 months, then Paul would have won the next election.
But I was struck in Canberra that in early '09, when the government was doing a very good job of battling off the global financial crisis, but doing a very poor job of telling Australians that they were doing that. And it came back to hurt them immensely. Nobody knew that they really threw everything at that, at fighting that recession. And one night Keating came on Lateline, and within about 2 minutes I remembered why he was so great. He said, and he gave us this lesson, masterclass in global economic policy, why he said, we've got to get the IMF out, we've got to get rid of the old G7, they're the debtor nations, we've got to get the creditor nations in. He said that the debtor nations are playing tricky poo, and the banks have all turned turtle, and that capacity to use words differently, but not to some idle purpose, to a serious purpose. And this was like a very brief interview, and it was always with Keating, with language. His language seemed to be best when he was in interviews or in conflict, because it was the intensity of the conflict that suddenly the words would come rushing down the pipe, and it was the intensity of the moment that he wasn't so good giving a prepared speech always, was he? No. He was best when he was in the arena.
Yeah, that's right. He was. He had this great. He had a sort of cartoon imagination. I mean, he did compare himself with the Roadrunner at one stage, and Hewson was Wile E. Coyote. He loved the Roadrunner. I mean, in fact, he liked all cartoons, I think.
And didn't he go beep beep in Parliament once?
Oh yeah. He did, and he was very funny in those things. I remember when we did a thing against violence in television, and Summers had sort of got it up, and no, he'd started it. He didn't like television violence. And anyway, we showed him an episode of The Simpsons where Marge, before he went out to speak, announced this new policy, and in which Marge Simpson runs a national campaign against violence in television because she's seen Itchy and Scratchy, the violent show that the kids love watching. Anyway, Itchy and Scratchy was showing as we were going out, and Paul was riveted by it, and he was just laughing his head off at Itchy and Scratchy before he went out to denounce violence in television, putting the cat through the mincer and chopping in a tiny piece. So, yes, he did like that. He was he was always had things moving. This animating language he was terrifically good at. But the Labor Party, by deciding in 1996 that everything to do with Keating was bad because he'd lost, gave up an incredible lot in the name of political pragmatism. I mean, that is, they gave up all their recent history, as I said, but they gave up any of the other lessons. They certainly gave up the Prime Minister's model of a powerful economy integrated with Asia, with a nice little social democratic republic in the South Seas, which was really Paul's idea. Creative, modern, bit of manufacturing there, some arts, all that sort of stuff. There was all a possibility, as a thing to pursue. But Labor gave up all that, and with it they gave up. I mean, really, what Rudd had to do when he got the job was to find a narrative to do that, and what was to serve him, because you can't win without a narrative, without a story. That's the one truism of political theory that holds. There's a lot of it is nonsense, but that's true. And the problem was, it seemed to me, that none of them. I can't quite work it out whether they don't know how to tell a story or they have no story to tell. But after a while, it must have seemed to some of them that you could actually you could have a history of legislative reform and win elections. You could actually do things, and people actually like seeing the concrete results of things. What was very hard for them was, in the case you're talking about, I think, is it's hard to tell people. It's like saying you've never had it so good. You've no idea what we just missed. There was that thing went past and you didn't see it. But it would have been a lot easier to tell if they'd maintained their narrative of the kind of country they were trying to build and the way the economy had been strengthened. They gave it all to Howard.
Yes, and you build things into your narrative, don't you? It becomes a story that adds as you go. It
sort of flexes.
So what do you... you've been out of that game a long time, but what do you see when you look at it now? I mean, I heard you say in Q&A the other night that nobody talks like a human being anymore in politics. And I just wonder why you think that's so. It can't just be because we replaced a bunch of human beings with a bunch of robots. There must be something changing in the culture as well to make that the case.
Well, probably on the Labor side, it may have something to do with the way the organisation now is structured. That is, we're not really getting any great shakes coming through. And I think it's also because there's as they say, a new paradigm in Labor politics, which sort of began with 1996, that you do anything but be like a Keating. Follow the polls, follow the focus groups, listen to them. They were around when we were there. You'd have someone running along behind you saying, "Don't say anything now, mate. Wait for Hoggy's polling." It was known as Hoggy's polling, Bob Hogg's polling. We'll have it on Friday. Wait for that. Don't say anything until Hoggy's polling. Until Keating would go mad and say, "If you don't shut up, I'll put Hoggy's polls." That became a habit and a received wisdom in the place, I think. But there also seems to me to be something, I mean, it's a bugbear of mine, and it was around too in the public service and elsewhere, and that is there is a sort of managerial mentality and a managerial language. And if you haven't got real language, then it's very hard to be a real human being. If your language is this sort of anodyne, platitudinous stupidity of managerial language, then it's very hard for you to express anything, much less a story. You can't. The old "speak that I may see thee." If you speak in this language, you can't see anything. All you can do is you may as well look at a wall and try. As well motivated as Labor's leaders may now be, they seem to struggle to ever sound spontaneous or characterful, or anything that's really identifiably human.
So your book makes quite an interesting point about that. You say that, in a way, Paul Keating took us to that world. He was the great economic wizard. He didn't use that language, but he was the one who embraced the economy as the thing that would fire up the place. You had to get people in jobs. You had to beat the inflation stick, you had to de-spiv the place, all of that stuff. But Don, he had the language to go through that. And once he left, there was only the economic realities and the managerial realities without someone of his linguistic powers to say, "Oh, that's a load of rubbish, I'm going to talk, from here."
Yeah, well, it was probably a very happy convergence that Keating came into the Labor Party or into the cabinet late in the Whitlam period. The lesson from Whitlam was that the Labor Party could not win or succeed without a better grasp of economics. And they set themselves to that task, and they inherited an outstanding Department of Treasury and Finance, a bunch of really good, dedicated people. I think they had a feeling in the 1980s that they were there's a tremendous sense of sort of professional zeal and integrity, I think, policy integrity, with Chris Higgins and Bernie Fraser and Don Russell and the rest of them. And Hawke knew his economics, and Paul had learned them off these people very quickly. And Kelty was a good economist. So they had this sort of tremendous corporate spirit, I suppose. But Paul didn't have the language of economics, really. He did. I mean, sometimes he could make eyes glaze when he drifted into this sort of stuff, but he always knew that to make it work, he had to animate it. So he sold the economic changes with images of levers and machines and, J-curve starting up here and coming down here. It was a cartoonist's dream.
Getting the cobwebs out of the place.
Yeah, and everything. He would drop in the Banana Republic, which everyone said, oh, shocking, what a stupid thing today. Hawke said shocking because it, messed up his day. But it was actually, a very telling remark, which in the end I think people learned something from. And even now, in the recession that we had to have, which would have to be one of the most politically inept remarks of all time, I notice Alan Kohler and other economists now say it was indeed the recession we had to have. It did de-spiv the country and it did get inflation out of the system and did all those things. Not a good idea to be saying it, but that's what it did. Now, I mean, we may be making Paul sound a little grander than everyone here would admit, but I just wish we had... it's not that we need another Keating, it is that we need another dozen people of similar character and articulateness and with a similar breadth of mind and a similar long view, who we can either hate or adore as we like. At the moment, it's very hard to feel very strongly about anybody, which is why the Thompson person is sort of an object of such total loathing, because there's no one to dissipate.
He's done something real.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, allegedly.
Yeah. Yes. Allegedly. Yes. They're only health service union workers. I mean, who cares? I mean,
I want to. I'll take questions in 5 minutes, but I want to just ask you. I want to change the subject and ask you about language in that world that you entered for 4 years. You say somewhere in the book that all day long in the office, things are asserted, developed, denied, repudiated in language, and yet there wasn't a book in the place. And it really resonated with my experience up there that language is this thing that people are very suspicious of, and yet they grind it out daily on industrial scale. There's press releases, there's speeches, there's reports. It's this sort of word factory, production, word machine up there, and yet people are very uneasy about language. Can really come back and bite you, can't it?
Yeah.
Did that strike you?
Yeah. Well, you've had that experience where you get a word wrong, then you think that the meaning is clear and specific, and it suddenly a journalist quickly reading it or reading it with evil intent can easily make it into something else. Yes. So there is a great concern about this, but
so it's a media thing in a way.
And it's always pushing people to say less and less and to merely message you. I mean, in a way, managerialism, which infected the public service in the 1980s, was a perfect language for politics dealing with an ever more demanding media cycle. So, you've got to go out and say something, try to say nothing. Or just stay on message, say the same thing over and over again.
And you fill the air that way.
You fill the air that way.
And the sentences are long.
So, I mean, but then it gets to, that is no explanation for making a policy speech or announcing an election in which you use a phrase as vacuous and egregious as moving forward 19 times, before you stop counting. I mean, when you think about it, for the Labor Party to go from the light on the hill to moving forward, it's some kind of decrescendo, isn't it? It's really, it's a dying fall, quite possibly. But that's really how it's come.
I thought though that moving forward was always in a way the Labor Party trying to say, it was a bit like there's been a big brawl at the wedding. There's been an internal brawl, and the groom is dead. And we're moving forward. And Annabelle Crabb put it nicely in the monthly. It's like a policeman saying at the scene of an accident, "Come on, move on, everybody. There's a very ugly accident. There's nothing to see here. And we're moving forward."
Yes.
And in a way, I think that slogan was they were kind of stuck. They had just executed the king.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't know what they were doing, and they didn't. When I say that, they didn't know what would happen next, and they were probably, I think, just get to this election, moving forward.
Yeah.
And anyway, that was my.
I think
my
that's
sense
right. But I mean, they might have been better to say, or just forward.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
With an exclamation mark or something.
It sounds a bit like something out of the 1930s, though, doesn't it?
Yeah. Go forth.
Go forth. Yes.
Just put some energy into it. That's the thing. I mean, a cliche is a really horrible thing, and it used to be that writing involved avoiding cliches wherever you could. Now it's, where's that cliche? I dropped it somewhere. Which one will we use now? And there are only about 6 left. They just use them over and over again.
The really interesting thing is that in Canberra, everybody talks about storytelling all the time. The public service talks about it, the political officers talk about it, the politicians talk about it. We've got to get our narrative. We've got to get our story. So I sense that as a kind of cry. We don't have one, or we don't know how to produce one, or else we're not cutting through. There's we're in a sort of insider-outsider moment when there's this sort of insider culture where everyone's having a fascinating time producing, and it is a fascinating world, and there are people out there who don't know what's going on, whether that's because the media is very weak at the moment, the mainstream media, but it's a serious problem, isn't it?
It may. I don't know whether it has something to do with what's in a sense an excess of democracy. I think it's very hard it's always difficult for politicians to establish the authority of the office. But it's Howard managed to do it with a couple of, he might have got knocked over in the first 3 years, but when he didn't, he began to make the office his own. And to be fair to Gillard, it's been, they all start badly. Howard started terribly, Hawke started terribly, they all do. Keating didn't start well. Gillard's had a lot more to put up with, a lot harder to start than anybody, not even counting for the fact that she's the first woman Prime Minister. But I don't see much chance of her being able to correct that, and I think it's particularly so because now really it's the era of every opinion being as good as another, and the instinct of politicians is to join the general throng. So, as I say, you never see them. It's like every day is an election campaign day. Once you only put on a hard hat or, made yourself look like a tradie in an election campaign. Now you have to do it all the time.
Every day Kevin had his hard hat on.
Kevin with a child, as if it was going to hit him or something. It was amazing. They ought to just wear them into the Parliament.
Or the hospital.
You got blue hats on one side and red hats on the other.
And the hospital smoke, of course.
Hospital smoke and one of those little gauze hats for filleting fish and all that. But they Twitter and they tweet and they do all this sort of business. And in the end, I think what they're sacrificing is any sense of, well, this is the Prime Minister or this is the leader of the opposition. There was Santa Maria. There was a week or two ago. I heard him say, you were preparing that in the green room. I'm coming to it. He said, as Bob Santa Maria, my great mentor, once said, and he proceeded to say what Santa Maria had told him. And you can't help but wonder whether Santa Maria also told him to wear jockettes whenever he's speaking. Can you imagine Bob saying, trust in the Holy Father, and I always found wearing underpants was a good idea when I'm addressing the crowd.
You described flying with Paul Keating once, and you look out the window and Paul looks down and there's a town you fly over where a girl has been murdered. And you say he would never comment about that. No, they would. Politicians comment on everything. They're asked to comment on everything, to be fair to them. If the mic's shoved in their face and they say, what do you think about the spat between Gordon Ramsay and Tracy Grimshaw? Well, probably they shouldn't buy in, but they do. Yeah. So it's a kind of dance, isn't it, in a way?
Yeah. And didn't Kim Beazley pull the wrong cord on one of those? He got someone confused.
Karl Rove. Perhaps we're not supposed to talk about that.
It was Karl Rove and Rove, the media person.
That's right, and yes. It's 7 o'clock, and I think I'm sure there are people here who would like to ask Don some questions. So I've got a hand over there. Yes, the gentleman. Can I just say before people, please questions, not statements, and if you can keep them brief so more people can ask questions, that'd be great. Thank you.
Hi, Don. A pleasure to have you here tonight. My question is, many people regard Keating's prime ministership as an unfinished revolution. I just want to know, what do you believe his agenda would have been had he won the 1996 election?
He's going to be here in about 6 weeks. It'd be better if you asked him. I think I'm on a hiding to nothing with this, but...
the internet never forgets, Tom.
Yes. I don't know. I mean, I don't think he was going to let the sorts of distractions which we've had ever since 1996. We may have had others. Hansonism, I think would have been put away a lot more quickly. But it's a funny thing about Hansonism. I mean, I have a feeling that it was actually perfectly manageable. That really the complaints of people who supported Pauline Hanson were not Tea Party-like madness. They were just people. It was about like managing a country, and the political parties were quite capable of doing it. But it was prodded along on the one side, and the other side didn't know quite how to respond. But I don't think that would have happened had Keating won. I think the same with the even though to their shame, I suppose, the Labor Party was responsible for setting up the first detention centres. I think it would have irritated Keating immensely that this issue should become the kind of the great national issue for a decade, and one we just seem unable to resolve in any political way, much less a humane way. Beyond that, I'm not really prepared to go, I don't think. But the interesting questions are the GST, what would have happened there, whether he would have been driven by some economic logic to have one, I don't know. But I'd much rather he did that. I'm in enough peril as it is.
Any other questions? In the front, and yep.
Hello, Don. We've met before, of course. I'm a journalist and a writer and anything else I can get at the moment. I find it really difficult to understand, and I can't get anybody to really explain to me why we're all using the term narrative. I don't know what the narrative is. And every time I ask people, what do you mean by the political narrative? I mean, if you say about the government, they've lost the plot, do we say, no, they've lost the narrative? Because to me, that's a story. Do you mean when you use that term, the policies, the vision, the whatever? Like Rudd needs a narrative, somebody else needs a narrative. Maybe I'm just way back old-fashioned, but I just don't understand what a narrative any longer is.
It means nothing more than a story. It's just become a more...
But when you say it's a story, is the story of them or the story of what they're trying to do?
Well, I suppose in the Hawke and Keating years, the story was... It went roughly like this, and I'll try and do it quickly. We'd had protection, industrial protection. We'd had a settlement with the unions dating from the Harvester Judgment of 1907. Those things were at an end. We could no longer operate in this way. We couldn't have, and therefore the Labor government of Hawke took it upon themselves to deregulate the economy, to go about finding a place in Asia. They took free trade upon themselves, hence APEC leaders' meetings and these sorts of things. Now, as we said before, the story is capable of all sorts of flexions, but because you have this tale, you're able to... And this will lead us to a period of unprecedented prosperity. We can hook ourselves into Asia, have a powerful economy, and then we can do all these terrific social things. We can make this a very happy little republic. The Republic is part of the story. In other words, you have a sense of progression which enables you to say to your opponents, they want to hold you back. They're advancing to the rear. As we are going this way, they're going back that way. So he runs his story about Howard and the diorama in the museum, with the Morphy Richards toaster and the Qualcast mower and all this sort of stuff. And so there are dozens of stories you could get once you put your opponent outside the story. You say, this person doesn't belong to this story, the modern Australian story. We do. That's the purpose of it. And when you haven't got one of those, you neither have a past nor a future, and you find it very hard to find the words to express what you stand for. It really is. It's a kind of dynamic context you put yourself in.
And can I just jump in there and say, in a way, I think the centre-left needs a story now. It doesn't have one. I think that the success of the Greens is a sign that a lot of people on the centre-left want more done on climate change. In fact, I think Julia Gillard's been heroic on climate change. I think getting through the carbon tax in the current environment intensely difficult, and a measure of her abilities in that area. But there hasn't been a story around that. I think it needed to be projected as a great success. Yeah. As a potential success, as the great advantages would come from new industries, the way we change the way we do things, but that hasn't been told. So the carbon tax could have been situated in a bigger story. To come back to your dynamic context, and I think that hasn't. For reasons I'm not sure either, it hasn't happened.
Well, if I could just add to that, I mean, the carbon tax the way they sold it was classic contemporary Labor politics, which is to find out what the focus groups indicate. The indication is, well, they don't want to be taxed. So we'll sell it as, we're giving you all these compensations for the carbon tax, without saying why we're having the carbon tax. So they think there's something fishy here, they think. They're going to give us all these tax concessions, but for what? Why not have a carbon tax? Then we don't need the tax concessions. Because nowhere did they get up and say, well, look, this is going to be the kind of modern Australian economy. Yeah. With a carbon tax. So it's actually a very progressive measure, not just about climate change, but a progressive taxation measure. And no one has done that. And you sit there just waiting and waiting for it to happen, and it doesn't. And if you don't do it straight away, it gets too late. I mean, John Hewson can explain the carbon tax in a flash in ways that really sell it to you. But Labor can't. And I don't know why that is. Well, I do know why it is, because it's a kind of skill they've lost.
Is it just the skill, or is the fact that leadership is too risky now, that apart from on the sporting field, any sort of passion or anything that's way ahead of the field is seen as too risky? Because my observations, for what they're worth, is that all of government is now extraordinarily risk averse. So forward-leading policy, the big story, the narrative is seen as risky. Now, whether that's poll-driven, whether it's media-driven, whether it's... Because surely there are leaders with character the way there were 20 years ago, but they're not telling the story. And I wonder if the reason is because it's seen as too risky.
I think that's a fair point, and I think when you borrow a lot of politics from management, you bring that with it. A lot of management theory is about avoiding risk, and saying things saying as little as possible while appearing to say much. On the other hand, I mean, it really doesn't work unless you do take a bit of a risk. I mean, Gillard has taken a risk on the carbon. She's staked the whole lot on the carbon tax. But what seems to me to be sort of tragic, it's like watching someone who's simply... It's not because the media's against her. It's not, which they obviously are. It's for none of those reasons. It's just simply that they seem unable to have the words. Now, that may be because... there is no one on the Labor front bench at the moment that we discovered who has the qualities of articulation that a leader needs. And maybe there's no one behind. I get the feeling it was probably the first time in the history of Canberra that a public servant, Ken Henry, actually had a bigger idea than any politician and was more articulate about it. that's a huge flip, because usually it's the civil servants who are so cautious about everything. But in any political meeting, in any group of politicians, you'll generally find 90% who are just simply waiting to see what the leader says and then anticipating whether he's going to win or lose and backing him according to that judgment. At the moment, it seems like 100% in the room are the same.
I think we've got time for one more question. The gentleman over there.
And it'll be a super quickie, Don. What are you working on right now?
A book about the bush, mainly. The Australian bush. In all its many and varied aspects. It's very difficult. If you've got any advice, I'll be grateful. I've been stuck in the Mallee for 4 months, and it's pleasant there, but I've got to get out. There's no water. But no, it's a. Pardon? I'm rooted in the Mallee. Yes, yes. I need a modern stump jump plough to get me over it. No, it's a book about. I don't know why I took it on, really, but it's a
big subject. It's a lot of bush.
It is, and everything about Australia is ultimately about the bush. It seems I'd forgotten this, but everything seems to relate to it. And the science is very complex. I don't know whether you know this, but it's terribly complex. The science of a tree is difficult. Of the interaction between trees, it's beyond me. And bushmen, they're complex as well. Or what are now called bushies, which is anyone who goes near the bush is a bushie. Even if your real job is being a lawyer in Pitt Street.
And politicians wear akubras, don't they?
Politicians wear akubras. Even politicians who live on the North Shore wear akubras.
With speedos.
The hats are very interesting. If you go down the Murray from... if you go up as far as, say, Walgett, up the Darling there, you'll see everyone wears big white hats. They're beef farmers. And as they go down, the hats get smaller. Until you get to Mildura and they're wearing little peak caps. They're the sort of Calabrian grape farmers.
They sort of evaporated as the river...
the hats just get... Yeah, as the river gets wider, the hats get narrower. No, it's curious. I might just write a book about hats and then I'll leave it at that.
You won't get in trouble with that anyway.
No, you should stay out of strife, yes.
I think, unfortunately, we're out of time. Don, as always, thank you very much for a terrific talk, and thank you all for coming. Thank you.